Fighter Command got the headlines during the Battle of Britain, but it was Bomber Command that carried the war directly into German cities night after night for nearly 6 years. This video documents every known British bomber used during World War II. From obsolete biplanes still flying reconnaissance missions in 1939, to a wooden aircraft so fast it could outrun German fighters without a single defensive gun. But one bomber on this list became so central to Britain's strategic campaign that Winston Churchill himself called it the shining sword that would win the war. And that aircraft is coming later in this video. We start with the early and light bombers of the opening campaigns. Fairey Battle, a single-engine light bomber that entered the war hopelessly outclassed, suffering catastrophic losses during the Battle of France when UNESCO formations were torn apart by German fighters. A brutal early lesson in what modern air combat actually demanded. Bristol Blenheim, one of the RAF's primary bombers at the outbreak of war. The Blenheim carried out some of the earliest British bombing raids of the conflict, though its light armament and modest bomb load left it increasingly vulnerable as German air defenses matured. Handley Page Hampton, nicknamed the Flying Suitcase for its narrow, cramped fuselage, the Hampton served through the early bombing campaigns before being relegated to torpedo and mining duties as newer four-engine designs took over strategic bombing. Now, the twin-engine medium bombers that carried Britain through the war's difficult middle years. Vickers Wellington, built using a distinctive geodetic airframe structure that allowed it to absorb tremendous battle damage and still fly home. The Wellington became the backbone of early bomber command raids, remained in frontline service longer than almost any other British bomber design. Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, an early heavy-ish bomber known for its nose-down flying attitude. The Whitley carried out some of Britain's first bombing raids on German soil before being progressively phased out in favor of true four-engine heavies. Bristol Beaufort, designed primarily as a torpedo bomber, the Beaufort struck German shipping and coastal targets, playing a quieter but genuinely important role in the naval side of the air war. Then came the four-engine heavies that transformed Britain's entire strategic bombing campaign. Short Stirling, the RAF's first four-engine heavy bomber. The Stirling suffered from a disappointingly low operational ceiling that left it more exposed to flak and night fighters than the designs that followed, and it was gradually shifted toward glider towing and transport duties. Handley Page Halifax, a genuinely capable heavy bomber produced in massive numbers. The Halifax flew tens of thousands of sorties over occupied Europe, and though it never achieved quite the same fame as its most famous counterpart, crews often praised its handling and survivability. Avro Lancaster. This is the aircraft referenced at the beginning of this video, capable of carrying a bomb load far heavier than any other Allied aircraft of the war. The Lancaster became the definitive symbol of Britain's strategic bombing campaign, flying the legendary Dambusters raid and delivering the enormous Grand Slam earthquake, bombs that could level entire fortified structures in a single strike. Now for the aircraft that proved speed could be its own form of protection. The Havilland Mosquito, built almost entirely from wood to save scarce wartime aluminum. The Mosquito was so fast that early versions carried no defensive armament at all, simply outrunning German fighters sent to intercept it. And it went on to serve in bombing, reconnaissance, and night fighter roles with equal brilliance. Bristol Beaufighter, a heavily armed twin-engine aircraft that excelled at night intruder missions and anti-shipping strikes. Its devastating firepower made it one of the most feared aircraft over the English Channel after dark, moving to specialized maritime and coastal bombers. Short Sunderland, a massive flying boat used for long-range maritime patrol and anti-submarine bombing duties. Its heavy defensive armament earned it the nickname Flying Porcupine among German aircrews who learned to avoid attacking it directly. Vickers Wellesley, an earlier, less common bomber design known primarily for setting long-distance flight records before the war. It saw limited operational bombing service mainly in North Africa and the Middle East. Bristol Blenheim Mark IV, an improved long-nose version of the original Blenheim, with better range and a more capable defensive position, extending the type's usefulness into the middle years of the war. Finally, a handful of aircraft that filled specific or transitional roles rarely covered outside dedicated aviation history circles. Handley Page Hereford, a troubled variant of the Hampton fitted with different engines that proved so unreliable. It was quickly relegated to training duties rather than combat. Avro Manchester, the Lancaster's direct predecessor and the aircraft it was ultimately developed from. The Manchester was plagued by chronically unreliable engines, and its failures directly informed the four-engine redesign that produced its far more successful successor, Vickers Warwick, a larger derivative of the Wellington intended as a heavier bomber. It ultimately found more use in maritime reconnaissance and air-sea rescue roles than in the strategic bombing campaign it was originally designed for. Balton Pole Defiant. Though primarily remembered as a fighter, a small number of Defiants were adapted for target towing and limited light attack duties later in the war. Fairey Swordfish, an open cockpit biplane torpedo bomber that looked utterly obsolete by 1939. Yet it famously helped cripple the German battleship Bismarck, proving that even outdated aircraft could deliver decisive blows under the right circumstances. There's an entire second tier of British bombers that rarely get mentioned outside dedicated aviation circles, but that filled genuinely important gaps throughout the conflict. Handley Page Harrow, a slab-sided transport bomber hybrid used briefly for early war bombing duties, before being reassigned almost entirely to transport and paratroop work. Vickers Wellington Mark VIII, a specialized torpedo-carrying variant of the Wellington adapted for maritime strike missions against enemy shipping in the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Bristol Bombay, a twin-engine bomber transport hybrid that saw limited bombing use in the Middle East before being relegated primarily to cargo and troop transport duties. Handley Page Halifax B Mark III, an improved late-war variant of the Halifax featuring more powerful radial engines and a distinctive rounded nose, addressing many of the earlier model's performance shortcomings. Avro Lincoln, a direct successor to the Lancaster developed too late to see significant World War II combat, though it represented the natural evolution of everything Bomber Command had learned about heavy bomber, designed by the war's final year. De Havilland Mosquito B Mark 16, a specialized high-altitude bombing variant of the legendary Mosquito, fitted with a pressurized cabin to allow crews to fly missions well above the effective range of most anti-aircraft defenses. Consolidated Liberator, RAF service. Though American-built, thousands of Liberators served under RAF command for long-range maritime patrol and strategic bombing duties, closing dangerous mid-Atlantic gaps that shorter-range British aircraft simply couldn't reach. Bristol Beaufort Mark II, an improved torpedo bomber, variant fitted with American-built engines after supply shortages threatened to halt Beaufort production entirely. A handful of aircraft filled roles so specific that even dedicated World War II aviation enthusiasts often overlooked them. Fairey Albacore, intended as a Swordfish replacement, this open-cockpit biplane torpedo bomber never fully replaced its supposedly obsolete predecessor, and both types ended up serving alongside each other for years. Blackburn Boda, a twin-engine reconnaissance bomber that proved so underpowered and difficult to fly that it was quickly withdrawn from frontline service and relegated to train duties. A cautionary tale about rushing a design into production. Short Stirling Mark III, a refined version of Britain's first four-engine heavy bomber, featuring uprated engines that only partially address the type's fundamental altitude limitations. Miles Martinet. Primarily a target tug aircraft, it occasionally filled light attack training roles, teaching bomber crews the gunnery skills they desperately need over occupied Europe. From the doomed Fairey Battles torn apart over French skies in 1940 to the wooden Mosquito that outran everything Germany could throw at it. British bomber development reflects a nation that learned brutal lessons early and adapted with remarkable speed. The geodetic Wellington kept flying home riddled with holes that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. The Lancaster carried bomb loads that reshaped what strategic air power could achieve. And the humble Swordfish biplane helped sink one of the most powerful warships in the world. Bomber Command paid an extraordinarily heavy price for that campaign, losing tens of thousands of aircrew over the course of the war. A human cost that remains one of the most sobering chapters of the entire conflict, carried on the wings of the aircraft that made up this list.